The European Union is one of those topics where there's a chasm of difference in opinions between those who are new to left-wing progressive politics and those who've been seasoned Marxists for years. For the baby leftists, it can often appear obvious that the EU is a bastion of progressive, egalitarian social values and even internationalism, especially in comparison to the evil, nasty USA. While for the elder Marxists, the EU being an imperialist association that stands in diametric opposition to the interests of the international working classes is such a glaringly obvious and self-evident fact that the matter isn't even worth discussing. This video is aimed at the former group, the leftists in training who are still in the process of developing their understandings of Marxism, imperialism, and where the EU fits into such analyses. By the end of this video, if I've done my job right, you'll be able to see the European Union for what it truly is. An anti-democratic, anti-communist, neoliberal, colonialist, imperialist, and ultimately irreformable association. And if I mess it up and you're still not convinced by the end of this video alone, you'll find even more damning information over on Second Thought's channel, where JT has just released a video in collaboration with this one about European imperialism and Frontex, the brutal agency behind Europe's border walls protecting Fortress Europa. Between these two videos, hopefully it'll become clear why European Union bad, actually. But first, if you're new here, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below for Marxist educational content and analysis. If you're in a position to do so and want to support the creation of Marxist educational videos, then please consider tossing €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon. If you're not in a position to support financially, you can also help out by sharing this video around on social media. Now, in order to understand the European Union's role in the world, we need to look at its origins. In the wake of the Second World War, Europe was in ruins. However, as the war didn't take place on US soil, aside from Pearl Harbor, the United States was able to get through World War II relatively unscathed, with most of its financial resources intact. It was thus able to emerge from the war as the largest capitalist imperialist hegemonic force in the world. Compared to the war-torn, decimated Europe, the US was still incredibly wealthy. But all this wealth wouldn't mean much if it had nobody to play with. The US needed to ensure that it still had allies and markets to trade with against the rising threat of the Soviets spreading from the east. So in order to maintain imperialist allies, to capture the markets of Europe, to restore Western capitalism and to thwart the rise of socialism, the United States pumped over $15 billion into rebuilding European capitalism through what's known as the Marshall Plan, or the European Recovery Programme. With inflation, that $15 billion would be roughly equivalent to $120 billion today. This would create an anti-Soviet, anti-communist capitalist bloc in Western and Southern Europe to protect against the spread of socialism from the East. Now, this $15 billion wasn't distributed equally among the European countries. The primary recipients of the Marshall Plan aid were the UK receiving approximately 50% of the funds, West Germany receiving approximately 12% of the funds, and France receiving approximately 8% of the funds. These three powers received approximately 70% of the support, with the remaining 30% being dished out among the rest of the southern and western European countries. Keep this in mind because today the European Union is led by the alliance of two massive capitalist imperialist powers, France and Germany, with the UK formerly being a major imperialist ally until it left the EU in 2020. So with the Marshall Plan, various countries in Western and Southern Europe began to rebuild capitalism in their countries and abroad. The process of capital concentration into fewer and fewer hands, typical of the transition from free competition to monopoly capitalism, occurred, with the formation of cartels, trusts and syndicates among the large capitalist powers to monopolise and corner markets. This occurred of course at the national level, but also across the borders that were standing in the way of the capitalists' maximum profits. To this end, the European Coal and Steel Community, or ECSC, the earliest precursor to the European Union, was established in 1951 by the Treaty of Paris to regulate the coal and steel industries of West Germany, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands and Belgium. Importantly, the ECSC was created by the capitalists who ruled these industries in collusion with their various capitalist nation states, rather than being created by the workers. So from the very roots of this European project, its basis was as an international monopolist capitalist association. It was never a proletarian internationalist project, but a project by and for the re-emerging imperialist bourgeoisie post-World War II. For those who've studied Lenin, you'll recognise that the formation of this International Monopolist Capitalist Association, the ECSE, corresponds almost word for word with Lenin's theory of capitalist imperialism, particularly its fourth characteristic as outlined in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. From this Marxist analysis, we can see that even the earliest precursor to the European Union, the ECSE, was itself already a capitalist imperialist association supported and funded by the United States to function as an anti-communist bulwark in Europe, preventing the spread of socialism from the East. Now, expanding beyond the monopolisation and regulation of just the coal and steel industries, the more industrially expansive European Economic Community, or EEC, was established in 1957 with the Treaty of Rome. While each of the member states of the initial EEC in 1957 were re-emerging capitalist imperialist powers in their own right, the EEC began to admit membership to underdeveloped, oppressed countries that were politically and economically useful from the 1970s onwards. This adds a layer of complexity to European associations that often gets missed. People frequently view today's European Union as a homogeneous imperialist bloc, wherein all member countries are more or less equal imperialist powers themselves, up there with France and Germany. However, the reality is that less than half of today's EU member states are actually imperialist countries in and of themselves. The majority of countries in the EU today are in fact oppressed semi-colonies. For example, Poland, Latvia, Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, etc. And let's not forget the EU's full old-style colonies like French Guiana in Latin America, just north of Brazil. Now, there are specific reasons why each of these underdeveloped oppressed countries will be granted admission to the European capitalist associations. For example, Ireland was admitted entrance to the EEC in 1975 to function as a resident tax haven for the imperialist powers. The Comprador Irish Free State continues to play this role to this day with tax avoidance mechanisms like the infamous Double Irish arrangement, which, while officially outlawed as of 2020, still exists in numerous slightly adjusted forms. For much of the Eastern European semi-colonial countries, these were granted admission to the EU to create a larger pool of workers for Western European capitalists to exploit, or as Marxists would say, a larger reserve army of labour. However, this isn't just bringing in permanent workers who'll enjoy equal rights and make the same minimum wage as any other worker in the country. Like the European tax avoidance mechanisms that are in place, there are also mechanisms in place to facilitate the undercutting of minimum wage, such as capitalists hiring workers from abroad on short-term temporary contracts as posted workers. EU law permits Western European capitalists to hire Eastern European workers from agencies on temporary contracts at the minimum wage rate of their home countries rather than at the higher minimum wage of Western European countries. This allows Western European capitalists to extract enormous profits from workers of the oppressed countries without even needing to travel abroad themselves. Instead, simply importing workers from the semi-colonies on short-term temporary contracts who are then paid far below the Western European national minimum wages. And so this brings us to the European Union as we know it today, which came into existence in 1992 with the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, and which in turn came into force the following year in November 1993. Already we can see why Marxists describe the EU as imperialist, with it being an international monopolist capitalist association. We can see why it's called colonialist from how it exploits the workers and oppressed masses of the world, including from the semi-colonies and colonies both inside and outside its own territories. And we can see why it's called anti-communist, as its foundation was specifically as a US imperialist-backed project to rebuild European capitalism and to stop the spread of socialism coming from the East in the wake of the Second World War. However, there's another crucial aspect to the EU's anti-communism, and that is the institutionalization of right-wing neoliberal economic policies which make it impossible by EU law for member states to transition towards socialism. One of the primary guiding principles of the European Union is that member states must conduct economic policy in accordance with the principle of an open market economy with free competition. Going as far back as 1957, the treaty establishing the European Community, now known as the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union or TFEU, includes classic pro-free market articles such as Article 81, which prohibits any government intervention in the economy which may affect trade between member states. Article 107, which prohibits state aid to strategic national industries. Article 121, which gives the European Council and the European Commission, both unelected bodies, the right to formulate the broad guidelines of the economic policies of the member states and of the Union. Article 126, which regulates the disciplinary measures to be adopted in case of excessive deficit. And Article 151, which states that the EU's labour and social policy shall take account of the need to maintain the competitiveness of the Union economy. The treaties have created a context wherein state aid, public procurement and nationalisations are all, in normal circumstances, essentially illegal under EU law, and this is enforced by the European Court of Justice, or ECJ. Furthermore, the EU forbids public monopolies, meaning that states can only provide services within the context of a free market rather than abolishing markets. So, if a government wanted to, for example, establish a public health service in an EU country that didn't already have one prior to its entry, the public health service would necessarily need to exist alongside a private health service in the context of a free market system. The private health service, not being subjected to the harsh European laws surrounding public institutions, would be able to flourish, and this in turn would erode and undercut the public sector institution, ultimately leading towards the dominance of the private sector and the eventual drowning out and selling off of said public sector institution. These EU laws and principles, combined with its so-called four freedoms, the free movement of goods, services, capital and people, all enforced by the ECJ, institutionalise neoliberalism as the mandatory economic trajectory for all EU member states. Under such strict neoliberal economic guidelines, it's basically impossible for countries to enact even minor social democratic reforms, let alone any kind of serious move towards socialist society. Under EU law, all roads ultimately lead to privatisation and the maximisation of profits for capitalists to the detriment of the well-being of the overwhelming majority of ordinary working people. And these treaties and structures aren't something that average citizens of the European Union can challenge or reform in any meaningful way from within. As the former president of the European Commission himself, Jean-Claude Juncker, stated at the beginning of Syriza's mandate, there can be no democratic choice against the European treaties. For a more contemporary example, people were recently very excited by the promises of a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government in Britain, and there were questions at the time about whether or not the Brexit vote to leave the European Union might be reversed by such a government. However, the policies proposed in Corbyn's platform, including renationalisation of key industries, state aid, public procurement, etc., would all have been illegal under EU law and would have incurred heavy sanctions upon Britain from the European Court of Justice. So even if the people of Britain had democratically voted in a left-leaning social democratic Labour government, and if Britain had remained in the EU, the democratic mandate of the people would have been completely subverted by the anti-democratic laws, treaties, structures and institutions of the European Union. The only options available to EU citizens then are to either A. accept these anti-democratic neoliberal terms and conditions wholesale, or B. reject the European Union itself, that is, to leave the European Union. Now, some may say, hang on, you can simply join the European Parliament yourself and change things from within, which, no, you can't. The European Parliament is a sham democratic institution that can't even propose its own legislation. At most, elected members of the European Parliament, or MEPs, can vote to approve, reject or make minor amendments to legislation handed down to them from the unelected executive body of the EU, the European Commission. However, even this sham democracy is undermined by the unelected Council of the European Union, which itself can vote to reject the decisions of the European Parliament. Oh, and did I mention how legislative instructions are handed down to the European Commission by an unelected shadowy group of financial oligarchs known as the Eurogroup? No, really, that's actually a thing. The Eurogroup refers to informal meetings of the finance ministers of the EU. It wields enormous power and yet has no legal basis whatsoever. How its meetings function is completely opaque, that is, how it functions is not transparent, with all decisions being made behind closed doors. It doesn't publish minutes of its meetings, it doesn't publish meeting agendas, it's completely unaccountable, even to the European Parliament, and yet it still holds enormous power, handing down instructions to the European Commission, which is again, the official executive power of the EU that proposes legislation and is the closest thing to an EU government. This is why even some liberals are forced to concede that there's a democratic deficit within the EU that they presumably hope to simply reform away. But as they say, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, as even the formerly pro-European Union reformers like Yanis Varoufakis came to realise. The EU can't be reformed as its very foundational treaties, laws, structures and institutions prevent that from ever happening. It can only be abolished. So, at this stage, it should be clear how the European Union was set up specifically to be an irreformable, anti-democratic, anti-communist, neoliberal, colonialist, imperialist association. Now what do we do with all this information? All progressive forces must unite in support for leaving the European Union and eventually for its complete dissolution. not on the basis of the disgustingly reactionary, right-wing, racist and xenophobic positions that dominated the political discourse surrounding Brexit, but instead with the progressive, left-wing, proletarian internationalist understanding that the EU is an irreformable, anti-democratic, anti-communist, neoliberal, colonialist, imperialist association. It's our job as those on the left to put forward this clear and concise left-wing analysis and perhaps break it down so that people can understand the true nature of this extraordinarily reactionary, anti-proletarian, capitalist imperialist union. The only way out of this neoliberal straitjacket to restore genuine democracy politically and make any kinds of advances towards socialism economically is to leave the European Union once and for all. Right, thanks very much for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another. Thank you to One Dime, who recently invited me on for a podcast on this very topic, which you'll find linked below. Much of the notes that I put together for that podcast were used for this video. Thanks as well, of course, to Second Thought for collaborating on this video. Don't forget to now go watch JT's video on the truth about the EU's borders and Fortress Europa after we're done here. Thanks especially to the relentlessly enduring supporters on Patreon who continue to make these videos possible. Thank you Blue Collar Red, Julia Aventranger, Ian McShay, Ugopnik, Ian Snyder, Jacob Jaff, Grimwater, Borku Gorilla, Ryan Hodgson, Soup, Madeline, Sonic232, Sagan, Michaela Schmid, Christian Nepales, Alfonso Dingo Torres, Mekalova, Rock Artist, Todd Sprang, Nikita Sage, Sakasi, Anglo-Irish Bolshevik, Amy Schmidt, Eli Leslie, Thomas Rossum-Wood, Bobby Block, Jason Schmidt, Dale Siebold, Train H13, Mitch Schiller, Saoirse Ní Bhealán, Roja, MLM in Practice, Brian Ruiz, Eric Lindahl, ZK Goody, Kyle Rapp, Robert Jarzak, Oyo Farah, Becky, Pastor Schubert, Mr. Miyamoto, Kyle King, Reverend London Hollywood, Wonderbad, JT Chapman, Joseph Shepard, Jack Schneidman, Comrade Amara, Welt for the 99% and Spoop. Cheers everyone, agus slán go fóill.